Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the entire New College community, may I again warmly welcome everyone who is here with us this evening, especially if you're joining us for the first time, and of course a warm welcome to all of those watching us online. We had a terrific time last night. The edited version of last night's lectures is already available via YouTube. If you search for New College Lectures 2025, you'll be able to recover last night's lecture, because I know of at least one person who was unwell and unable to be with us last night. Let me begin by respectfully acknowledging again the Bidjigal as the traditional custodians of these lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. I recognise the ongoing presence and contribution of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples and commit myself to listening and learning and walking with them. Last night I acknowledged our distinguished guests at our 2025 lectures. I'd like to acknowledge again my fellow trustees, the Right Reverend Dr Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney, and Emeritus Professor David Cohen. I'd also like to thank the entire New College team who've laboured to make the New College lectures this year a reality. Many of them work unseen to you, but special thanks to Dr Danny Scarrett and the Reverend Dr AJ Culp for their coordination of the lectures this year. And also unseen is the New College Board, and they work tirelessly on behalf of the college, and as Master and CEO I very much appreciate their support. If you're new to New College or visiting us for the first time on live stream, our college community consists of the present students of this building, about 250 undergraduates at the University of New South Wales. This original New College has an outstanding record of academic achievement at the university, and we also have our postgraduate college, New College Postgraduate Village, across the road. 315 students, mostly almost entirely postgraduates, share life with us there. There are approximately 50 PhD students and postdoctoral fellows that form part of that community. It's a remarkable place. And we've got approximately 7,000 alumni who've been members of these communities over their existence. We're affiliated with the University of New South Wales and affiliated with the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. And we hold these lectures as a special service to the Australian community. We have a small research group called the Centre for Christian Apologetics, Scholarship and Education, and AJ, Danny and I are co-editors of a quarterly publication which is available for inspection up the back here, and unsurprisingly is called Case Quarterly. So please feel welcome to have a look at these after the lectures this evening. There are many excellent books available, and I forgot to bring my pile up the front with me, and Chris will testify it is a large pile, but Some New World, Peter Harrison's latest work, is available for sale up there. Questions, questions, questions. This is an important part of the New College lectures. Now, I'm hoping the slide will appear up here. Please, that's certainly up on the side thing there, so please use that QR code, or you can go to this URL. Please open that now, if you wouldn't mind, with your mobile device, because the important thing is, as Peter speaks to us this evening, there's the opportunity to actually, as questions occur to you, you can punch them in, and they're ready for us when we get to question time. Now, if you prefer more traditional methods, please just put your hand up. Someone up the back will give you a piece of paper and a pencil. You can write your question on there. You can put your hand up again when you'd like them to collect it. So we will accommodate all sorts and conditions of people here at the New College lectures this evening. And especially for those that are younger amongst us, please, please, please ask your questions, guys, because I can guarantee if you've got a question, there's probably 10 other people in this room that were dying to ask the same question. We're a bit too frightened to do so. All right, fire alarms, we head out that direction out of the college. Bill's old joke. Emergencies of a different kind can be dealt with in this corridor over on my right, your left. And perhaps you might like to join me by taking your electronic device into which you've scanned your code and just check that you've turned it to silent as well. That would be a helpful thing to do. Professor Peter Harrison is a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame here in Sydney, and he's Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland. From 2014 to 19, he was an Australian Laureate Fellow, and prior to this, the Indrios Professor of Science and Religion and Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre at the University of Oxford. He has written many books, including this most recent contribution, Some New World. He's an international authority on history, philosophy and the humanities, and we're greatly privileged to welcome him again to New College this evening. I've got no doubt that Peter will share a short summary of last night's lecture in a moment. I thought I'd just give a very short reflection on my learnings from last night. The first thing is I went and gathered Aristotle off the shelf and started dusting it off and inspecting the interior, and noticed how many words and how closely typed spaced the text is. Anyway, we'll get there somehow. And I held probably some fairly serious misconceptions about the origins of university. I think the main points that came to me was how all of those in early times going to university had a specific focus on what is good and what it means to do good, and that came from both Greek and Christian traditions. There's ongoing debates about practical training in universities, but that was there from the beginning, and some of these higher forms of learning, theology and philosophy, were later additions and created tensions which have existed ever since. And this historical ongoing tension between theory and practice, and indeed in Christian circles a debate between right theology and good practice. And I thought one of the great ironies, you can't quite see it, ladies and gentlemen, but the university crest is behind that screen over there. You can just see it peeking out from the corner. The founders of the University of New South Wales chose as the motto Scientia, knowledge, Manue Monte, meaning hand and mind, or theory and practice. So in fact, at the origins of the University of New South Wales, they actually recognised in the formation of the university that both higher level thinking and practical thinking were to be a part of university life. And last night's lectures were terrific for those of us running university residential colleges. They're places of great formation, and so some of the things that Peter was talking with align very well with, in terms of what we're aiming to do in colleges and how they align with ancient university traditions. And then, even in my field of engineering, debates continue to rage about theory and practice. Should we be teaching the fundamentals of the discipline or the good practice of engineering? Anyway, tonight Peter will share with us about the rise of science and how ways of viewing the world have shifted as a consequence. But before he comes to speak to us, if you don't mind, I'm going to pray, if you'll join me. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet again here this evening, we thank you again for the freedom we have in this country to discuss matters of belief and faith without fear. We pray for your blessing upon our lecturer this evening. You would grant him again clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you and a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Harrison.
Well, thanks, Bill, for that welcome and for the introduction, and indeed for the summary of last night's lecture, which I'll correct in a moment. But no, and look, thank you all for coming, and a special shout out to those who are watching online. I will actually briefly talk about some of the things I spoke about last evening. And I think one of the broad aspect of the theory that I'm outlining over the three lectures is that secularisation, the decline in the influence of religion in our society, has made it difficult to make appeals to intrinsic values, right? Because the sorts of values are so varied now that we can't anchor these appeals very well. So there's a direct link, I think, between secularisation and the increasing difficulty to justify what we do at universities in terms of goods or intrinsic values. And as a result of that, we tend to resort to good for arguments, which is to say arguments from intrinsic value. But again, as I suggested last night, ultimately those need to terminate in some conception of the good. So we're back to where we end up. Some of the questions last night, and it's always great to have questions because it helps clarify for me what I'm talking about very often, or perhaps even change my mind about things. So do hit those question buttons. But there was a question about theology, a question about science and its changing meanings. For those of you who are familiar with my work, and that might not be too many of you, one of my methods of doing historical research is to look at the changing meanings of words or their changing frequencies. And you will have noticed that last night I mentioned that the term theology was not used in the Christian tradition until about the 12th or 13th centuries. And initially theology was regarded with suspicion because theology was what the pagans did. So Augustine, for example, the 5th century church father, regarded theology as something to be avoided because that was pagan talk about the gods. So in the 13th century, when theology starts to emerge as a university discipline, there's controversy about its status. But the general historical point, I think, that we need to bear in mind with something like this is that Christianity flourished for more than a millennium without this conception of theology, right? So what does that tell us about what Christianity consisted in prior to that time? Now, the same, interestingly, is true for the concept religion, which doesn't get much of a look in the canonical documents of Christianity, arguably none at all. There is the Greek word thraskaya, but religion is not a significant thing. So the idea of Christianity as a religion is also something that only appears in the 17th century. So the absence of our concept religion should make us reflect about how Christians conceptualised what it is they were doing. If they didn't have a conception of theology until the 13th century, they didn't have a conception of religion until the 17th century. So these conceptual histories are ways into understanding different ways of imagining what activities like going to university or indeed what Christianity consists in. And I'll do one more, science, because the question I got last night was, aren't you conflating all these conceptions of science? And the questioner who I know knows that I know that he knows that I know that I wasn't conflating them. But it was a good point to make because, you know, often we just assume that when we use this word science, it has a consistent meaning throughout history, and it doesn't. And the interesting thing about the way scientia is used in Aristotle and going right through to Aquinas and into the early modern period is that the primary meaning of scientia in the Latin is that it's a virtue. It's an intellectual virtue, just as religion, religio, was a moral virtue. But these things over time get transformed into things out there. And so they, as the sociologists say, they're reified. And so the way in which these words change their meaning and change the way they function in society is a really useful way of us getting insight into just how different people thought about things or experienced things in the past. And so the history is strange, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, and understanding the history of concepts helps us get some sense of that. Now tonight I'll talk about the natural-supernatural distinction, and this is another one that comes into existence around the 12th century. So if you look at the Christian writings up till the 12th century in Latin, supernaturalis doesn't really appear until Thomas Aquinas starts to use it. Okay, there are versions in the Greek, but again, what this says to us is we have to think that these people are operating without a conception of a sharp natural-supernatural distinction. There aren't other terms that do that work. Okay, but I'll come to that later. But I just wanted to lay out this as one of the ways in which historians can understand or try to understand what's going on in the past. Okay, we better get into the lecture. I'll get my watch out so that I can make sure we don't keep you too late. Right. So the scientific revolution of the 17th century is rightly regarded as a watershed in Western history. Our conception of the world and its operations was completely transformed, and on most accounts, owing to the progenitors of modern science, figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton and Kepler. So, given the secular naturalistic character of science today, it's commonly assumed that the success of modern science was built on a transition from a religious, faith-based culture of the Middle Ages to something like a naturalistic, rationalistic approach to the natural world. And that's the view I'm going to contest this evening. But before I do that, I want to just get in our heads what I mean when I talk about naturalism and naturalistic. And just to give you an idea, here is Exhibit A, Sean Carroll, who is a populariser of science and a theoretical physicist. He subscribes to this view, naturalism, and this is what he understands it to be. It's just one world, it's run by laws of nature, there's nothing else, right? No supernatural stuff, no supernatural entities or powers, okay? And really for him this goes hand in hand with science. If you're going to do science, this is the view you need to adopt. And we sometimes refer to that as ontological naturalism. Most scientists, and sociologically we know from studies, most philosophers and humanities scholars adhere to this view. That is, they believe it. Now, some admittedly espouse a weaker methodological version of that view, and that really is the idea that we pursue our disciplines as if this were the case. So when we do history or science or psychology, we don't make any assumptions about supernatural entities or powers, okay? And that's methodological naturalism. And that means that you can have belief that there is a God, but you don't let that affect the way you pursue the discipline. Methodological naturalism. So some form of naturalism, either the strong version or the methodological version, is thought to have been a distinguishing feature of modern science, its inception in the 17th century. And in case we have any doubts about that, a court decided this was the case. So in Dover, Pennsylvania, when there was a trial about intelligent design and whether that could be taught in schools, the judge made a determination that it could not be taught as science in schools. It was not science, he said. Why? Because it wasn't naturalistic. It invoked some theological principle. And so, as the judge said, rigorous attachment to natural explanations is part of science. And then, interestingly, the historical claim, that has been the case, he says, since the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. And he did this on the basis of expert opinion. Now, if he'd asked me, I would have given him a different story, because I don't think naturalism has been characteristic of science since the 17th century. And if that's true, then it can't be intrinsic to science. And so the burden of part of tonight's lecture is to suggest to you that that's the case. Okay, now, if naturalism is thought to be one characteristic of science, its usefulness is thought to be another characteristic. So given the many practical benefits that flow from science today, we assume that its promise should have been apparent even in its infancy. And once we learned how to do science, in other words, it should be obvious that we should get on with it and do it. Okay, so the question of why we ought to do science, on our current understanding, would never really have arisen. But it did arise to people in the 17th century. And what I want to suggest to you is that science was not, in the early modern period, naturalistic. It was not. Questions were asked about its practical usefulness, and questions were asked about whether it was worth significant social investment of the kind that we see as common in the sciences today. Look around this university at how many buildings there are for the scientists. Okay, so what I want to do in this lecture is to suggest the emergence of science was not premised on a separation from religion, but the opposite, a forging of a new and stronger partnership with religion than had been the case in the Middle Ages, the medieval period. In addition, I want to suggest to you that the social legitimacy of the new science was established by appeals to religious values. Now, what I mean by the social legitimacy of science is just its social licence, why people thought it was a good thing to do. And the third aspect of this is that presuppositions about the orderliness of nature that informed modern science were also grounded in theological conceptions. Now, given all this, given my suggestion that everything we thought about the origins of science is wrong, the question is, how did we come to think about science as being inherently naturalistic and obviously useful? And that was a bit of propaganda work that was done in the 19th century. So part of what I want to persuade you about tonight is that our view about the origins of science is wrong if we think it was naturalistic from the start. And then I want to say, how did we come to hold that view? And as I say, there was some interesting historical reconstruction work done in the 19th century. Okay, so here's how we're going to go. We'll talk about, first of all, this question about the legitimacy of science, why we should do it, and then this idea of the supernatural, and then I'll talk about how naturalism arises in the 19th century and takes over the story, and then how people kind of made up histories about science. So I'm going to talk first of all then about the social legitimacy of science. And don't worry about those just yet. The social license of science is something we tend not to think about because for most of us the benefits of science are just obvious. Even the most ardent science skeptics, people who might be vaccine hesitancy or against evolution or whatever, if they break a leg, they're off to the emergency department. Or if they have a toothache, they go and see the dentist. When modern science was in its infancy, it didn't have a sustained record of successes. It didn't have a sustained record of successes. So that question was up for grabs. Moreover, that era had a very different conception of what counted as success. What are the kinds of things that we should value as a culture? For example, if natural science held out the promise of material improvement, but at the cost of want for a better expression we might call spiritual improvement, there might be grounds for ambivalence about whether science is something we should do. So we can think in this context, in the present, you think about the proliferation of social media or AI or any science-based technology. We have debates today about whether the social costs of these things are worth the advantages, the putative advantages that they have, right? It was a similar debate in those days. So it's also important to understand that at this point in history, there was nothing inevitable about the emergence of modern science. There was no historical trajectory that says science is something that must necessarily emerge. In other words, what we would say is that what happens in the West is historically distinctive. It doesn't happen anywhere else, and historians would say it's contingent. And we get some sense of this when we look at these places, which we can think of as contrast cases. When we compare medieval Europe with its counterparts, we see evidence of scientific activity in other places. We see it in China, we see it in Arabic cultures, we see it, of course, in ancient Greece. However, the long-term pattern in these places is what we might call something like a boom-bust pattern, that science becomes important. There are brief moments of efflorescence, but societies find other things to prioritise, and science doesn't move into the centre of the culture. It does not, as my friend and colleague Stephen Gogrodger used to say, it doesn't consolidate. And that's a distinctive feature of West, that science consolidates. It becomes a permanent feature of the culture, and it becomes the dominant model that provides the cognitive basis of how we know everything. That doesn't happen anywhere else. So what needs to be explained is not just the rise of science as a contingent historical phenomenon, but how it comes to occupy such a position of dominance. And that question is essentially to do with its capacity to appeal to a particular set of values that we don't have in these other cultures. And they are the distinctive Christian values of the West. So it's important to understand, it wasn't as if these cultures were trying to do modern science and failing. We need to be clear about that, right? It could be that they might have had the option to do it and decided not to, okay? And one helpful way of thinking about this is to consider the views of the sinologist Joseph Needham, who asked the question, why didn't science happen in China? Why did it happen in the West? And there's a complicated historians are going to argue the toss over this. Needham had a particular view, but part of it is to do with this conception of the values of Chinese society. So this will at least give us some idea of the principle. Wealth wasn't valued, it didn't have spiritual power. So what was the ambition of the Chinese merchant for his son? Not that he would become a successful merchant, but that he would study for the imperial examination and become a bureaucrat, right? Given that context, to appear on the rich list would be a matter of family shame and embarrassment, and not smug self-satisfaction, right? So clearly we've had a cultural shift in what things are valued, and to some extent it's the same with science. So if we think back to the previous lecture, we can also contrast the Chinese picture with, the priorities of the classical and medieval Western traditions. The influential Aristotelian organisation of the sciences ranked pure theoretical contemplation at the top of the hierarchy of knowledge, and the productive sciences is at the bottom, as we have seen. Oh, once again, I'm jumping ahead. Now, Christianity reinforced this by prioritising activities that promoted moral and spiritual formation over catering to material needs. And in both traditions, the classical tradition and the Christian tradition, the contemplative life was to be preferred to the active life. If I can get... I thought I had those words up there, but I don't. This beautiful painting is a painting... Oh, there we go. Is a painting of Jesus in the home of Martha and Mary. And you can see Martha in the foreground, and if you look way into the background, you can see Jesus and Mary. And the kind of irony of this is that the flashiness of... So the story of Mary and Martha, I'm assuming you know this story, right? Jesus comes to the home of Mary and Martha. Martha gets on with preparing a lavish meal, and Mary talks to Jesus about spiritual things, as it were. Now, this was interpreted throughout history as being that Mary had chosen the right path, and the flashy, active life that Martha represents was not to be preferred, even though it's using up most of the picture, right? But the real priority is what's going on in the background. So in both Christian and classical traditions, there was a discussion about the relative merits of the contemplative and active lives. If you were here last night, you recall in a sense that reflects Aristotle's elevation of the theoretical sciences over the active sciences, okay? And that was part of the tradition. So part of what's going to happen in the change of values that lead to the practical sciences being valued is we're going to get a switch in the valence of these things. And the active life is going to be preferred to the contemplative life. And that switch of valence is going to be part of what's going to drive then a practically oriented scientific culture. And the way in which the valence shifts, as we'll see, is to do with a set of religious arguments that change the religious trajectory, as it were. Okay, so there's something distinctive in early modern Europe that changes the social priorities. An obvious candidate for this is the Protestant Reformation, and that indeed is a good part of the story. Okay, but one place where we can see how this starts to play out is in controversies in the 17th century. When a new experimental science comes onto the scene, we have controversies about its usefulness. Is this a useful thing to be pursuing? Now, the best-known critique of the new sciences is, I think, in Gulliver's Travels, where he has this story where Gulliver goes to the Grand Academy of Lugano, and they're doing all these crazy experiments which actually map onto experiments that were conducted in the Royal Society. But if you've read this passage, you'll know that Swift just thinks this is a huge joke, that what's going on in the Royal Society is essentially useless and a waste of time. Royal Society, one of the first scientific societies, the longest continuing society, founded in 1660. Okay, but Swift, writing in the early 18th century, is building on a much longer tradition of people mocking science and regarding it as useless. So, for example, one 17th century wit wrote that experimental scientists were only good at two things: diminishing a commonwealth and multiplying a louse. Now here he's referring to the beautiful microscopic drawings of Robert Hooke in the book Micrographia. He was a pioneer of microscopy, produced these beautiful drawings, and the upper echelons of society saying, why? What a waste of time. Another agreed that fellows of the Royal Society can admire nothing except fleas, lice and themselves. Even the patron of the Royal Society, Charles II, was said to have laughed mightily at the fellows' attempts to weigh the air. Now, it sounds crazy, weighing the air, but he's referring here to Robert Boyle's experiments with the air pump that are very important in understanding atmospheric pressure. And of course, Boyle is the guy who gives us Boyle's gas law, right? As all the scientists are nodding, P1, V1, etc., right? So there you go. But at the time, is this useful? Question mark. Now, a more common line of criticism was that experimental natural philosophy, as they called it, because science is a branch of philosophy, this new experimental approach to philosophy failed to accomplish the main goal of learning, which was moral formation, right? How does this stuff contribute to moral formation? So supporters of the traditional Aristotelian university education denied claims that the new science was dignified and useful. And the kinds of things they said, if I can get them up. What should I be pointing this? Oh, here, sorry, this. So this guy, Merrick Casaubon, what is useful and what is useless, okay? And I'll let you read it for yourselves. And I'll give you some more reading over there. So the argument, and I'll tell you what the argument is too. The argument is, if science is just doing useful stuff, it's essentially doing what the brewers and the bakers do. And these are low-status occupations, right? And what's much more important, as this second criticism suggests, is Aristotle, ethics. If Aristotle had never written anything else, if he hadn't written any of those terrific scientific works, if he'd just written his ethics, that's all we need, okay? So the emphasis in the university education is not on this newfangled experimental philosophy that's generating a few practical things. It's on moral formation. Okay, so they're the standard lines of criticism. Now, advocates for the new science are going to respond to this. And what they argue is, and they appeal to religious values to argue, and they argue a number of things. First of all, they say the scientific revolution was a providentially ordained reformation of knowledge. So they linked it back to the Protestant Reformation. So it was a providential historical event. So there's Tobbs, don't worry about him. So Francis Bacon, who is one of the most important figures in terms of setting out the logic and justifications of the new experimental science, he says this: God foreordained the rise of science to coincide with the Protestant Reformation. So when God wants to reform the church, at the same time, he also reforms our knowledge, right? And science is this process of reformation. So there's a new spring for all knowledge, right? So there's a providential justification for this new stuff. Okay. Another line of defence, Thomas Sprat, who was a bishop, a fellow of the Royal Society, wrote in 1666 a history of the Royal Society. Now you might think that 6 years after its foundation is a bit premature to be writing its history, but he's writing what is in essence a defence of the usefulness of the activities of the Royal Society. So there's the book. And he runs the same argument, that you've got dual so just as the wonderful Church of England is a great reformed version of religion, so the Royal Society as an institution represents the reformation of scientific knowledge. Note, he's calling it philosophy, but as I said, science is part of philosophy. So this is a reformation of philosophy. Okay, Sprat. Now, a further connection to the Protestant reformers was, Luther attacked Aristotle, but I won't go into that in significant detail. I think more important was the rise of a Protestant conception of the religious vocation. Now, oversimplifying a little bit, Protestants challenged the sharp distinction between the clergy and the laity, in effect arguing for the sanctity of all secular pursuits. So the priesthood was just a different kind of activity, but it wasn't any more spiritually significant than what anyone else was doing. Now, it followed then that science could itself be a sacred activity, just as sacred as the acts of the clergy or the priesthood. So, here is Robert Boyle. Kepler. Let's start with Kepler and then we'll go to Boyle. So Kepler, famous astronomer. Kepler's the guy who discovers the elliptical orbits of the planets. He discovers the so-called 3 laws of planetary motion that Newton subsequently subsumes into his single law. So Kepler is a really important precursor to Newton, and he says, I wanted to be a theologian. Kepler is a Protestant. I wanted to be a theologian, but now I understand that essentially doing the work of astronomy is just as important in religious terms as doing the work of the priesthood or doing theology. Robert Boyle, I said we'd get to him. Robert Boyle, of Boyle's law, some say the father of chemistry. This is what we do in the new natural philosophy. We discover the perfections of God, and that is a more important act of religion than the sacrificial acts that we see the priesthood carrying out. So Boyle has this conception, priests of nature. We are all priests of nature. So it was a very small step from this to say that the pursuit of experimental natural philosophy, science, was an intrinsically religious activity. And Boyle also says quite directly that, natural philosophy is philosophical worship of God. Okay? So these Protestant ideas of vocation lend science a new sanctity. It's an inherently religious activity. Newton says something a little bit similar in his masterwork, the Principia, in the appendix to the Principia, and it's the last line, the last bit of this that's the important part, that to talk about God is an aspect of natural philosophy. In other words, God talk is integral to science. That's how we parse that statement there, right? Now think back to what the judge said in the court case in Dover, Pennsylvania. Science was naturalistic from the start. Here is the key figure of the scientific revolution saying that God is intrinsic to the scientific process, the natural philosophical process. Okay. So the Protestant emphasis on the religious character of the mundane and everyday pursuits looks like a sacralisation of secular work. By the same token, we can say that this flattening of sacred and secular orders could have the opposite consequence of secularising the sacred, right? If everything is on the same level. And this, I think, is why the sociologist Max Weber would talk about Protestantism as being a kind of secularising, disenchanting force. Because insofar as that it did away with the difference between the sacred and the secular and placed it all on a single plane, it was possible to understand that either as sacred or as secular. And as we will see, this is what happened in the natural-supernatural switch. So for Weber, the Protestant ethic is an important... I haven't really talked about the Protestant ethic, have I? I won't. I'll postpone that till next week. But here's the important thing. We often tend to think of secularisation as the kind of overtaking of religion by something non-religious. I think Weber is exactly right to see secularisation as something that emerges out of Protestant Christianity and its capacity to desacralise. So it reduces the number of Catholic sacraments, right, from these channels of divine grace. It doesn't believe in contemporary miracles. It does away with the distinction between the priesthood and the laity, and these are all disenchanting moves, okay? So Protestantism is making science possible, religious values being appealed to, but there's a sense in which these religious values are also pointing ahead, looking at something a little bit like secularisation. Okay, let me find out where I'm up to. Yeah, so here's the point I kind of wanted to say, because it's relevant to how getting on the rich list becomes an important thing. The Protestant ethic for Calvin then emphasises the sanctity and importance of work and labour. Now, Weber has a story about this as a sign of our election. I'm not sure how that works, but I do think nonetheless that Protestantism emphasises the importance of labour, and somewhat against the original intention of Protestant reformers. This will mean a shift in our understanding of what the accumulation of wealth will consist in. And I'll come to that in a moment. So, returning to controversies over the values represented by the new science, defenders of science also found it necessary to address the criticism that that natural philosophy no longer met the traditional goals of learning, which was moral formation. Okay, but if we look at what people like, so here's the point I wanted to make, that one of the valence changes that is really remarkable is that somehow the vice of avarice, the quest for money, one of the 7 deadly sins, gets transformed from the medieval period into the modern period, where the accumulation of wealth is okay, and not only that, it's something to be desired. How does that happen, right? How does that happen? Complicated story, overdetermined, as the historians say, but the Protestant ethic is a part of that story. And I say, let's bear in mind that there are unintended consequences of historical changes, and so things happen in history that are not intended by the agents who bring them about. And if you want the big book on that notion, read Brad Gregory's book, The Unintended Reformation, where he lays out the ways in which the Protestant Reformation has given rise to a number of aspects of modernity. But this is one thing Brad Gregory is interested in giving an account of, and certainly it's something to be explained, whether you accept his account of things or not. Okay, so moving on then. Here's the point about science being morally formative. So again, Robert Boyle, the scientific study of nature, he says, inculcates particular virtues, sentiments of devotion and virtues, okay? And so it just does what the moral philosophy was supposed to do. That's the argument. The naturalist John Ray, one of the pioneers of botanical taxonomy, the study of botany stirs up affections and habits of admiration, humility and gratitude. So it's morally, the sciences are morally formative, goes the argument, and to that extent they fulfil the goals of traditional philosophical understanding. Thomas Spratt, who wrote The History of the Royal Society, devotes a number of pages of his history to arguing for the morally formative capacities of the new experimental science. And just the bits in yellow, you'll get the point, okay? Science does the stuff that moral philosophy seeks to do, and he would argue it does it better. Now, a further dimension to this line of argument was that science embodied a fulfilment of the twofold command to love God and love neighbour. So Robert Boyle argued that when we study God in the creation, we're loving God, and then we get the material benefits of science, these represent love of neighbour. So that twofold imperative is then said to be exemplified in the practices of science. And Francis Bacon also argued that science was a way of expressing the preeminent Christian virtue of charity. Now, one last aspect about the religious, components of modern science was an appeal to the biblical idea of the fall and the construction of experimental science as a redemptive enterprise, as inherently religious. So here's the notion of the fall, that Adam in his perfection had a perfect knowledge of the creation. He had a mastery of all of the animals. After the fall, they are expelled from the garden. The animals go wild. He loses his knowledge of nature. He loses his dominion over nature. What then is science in this context? for Francis Bacon, science is a mechanism by which we can recover the dominion over nature that we lost as a consequence of the fall. And in that sense, it's a redemptive activity that parallels the activities of religion. So as he says here, human beings, as a consequence of the fall, fell away from their innocence, their moral innocence, and their mastery of the creation. Both of these things can be recovered in the present world. You don't have to wait for the future life. In the present, religion helps us with our moral aspects, and the sciences help us recover our dominion over nature. Okay? So science then is a redemptive enterprise that helps us deal with the losses that accrued as a consequence of the fall. Okay. Just waiting for this to move on. So creation, he says, wasn't forever going to be rebellious, but in time, through the uses of science, various labours, right, physical labours, will be reduced to once again providing human needs. Now this then, I think, became a common theme in the Royal Society, that science was a way of overcoming the losses that human beings experience as a result of the fall. So here's the book Micrographia. It has all the beautiful drawings of the fleas and the lice and the needlepoint and all that stuff, which is a great book if you ever get to see it. But notice that what he says in the preface is that what we're doing in science is what are we doing? We're not engaged in forbidden knowledge as Adam and Eve were in the garden, but rather fruits that were never forbidden. Okay? So it's the kind of reverse of what happened in the Garden of Eden. And this then became a dominant theme in the 17th century for understanding what science was about. It was about recovering what was lost as a consequence of the fall. I won't read those, but that will just give you a bit of the flavour of how people thought about science in relation to the fall. Now, there's a whole story about how this is going to be implicated in the ecological crisis, because this view of the mastery of nature sees wild nature not as it originally was, but as it's the fallen condition. So the religious motivation for agriculture and to bring it under control is regarded as restoring it to the state it was once in Eden, when it perfectly served human needs, right? So the wildness of nature being something to be tamed has a religious impulse at this period, and arguably then is implicated in these worrying dominion over nature kind of stories that give rise to some of the environmental problems that we're experiencing today. Okay. Finally then, there's something distinctive about experimental science, and I won't go into all of the details of this, but experiment was regarded as a particularly, it wasn't just science per se, it was experimental science that did the trick for various reasons that I won't go into, but I'll just give you these examples here of people arguing that experimental science was the way to overcome the consequences of the fall. Bishop John Wilkins, another bishop who's in the Royal Society, talking about artificial experiments reverse the consequences of the fall. And then Robert Hooke in the Micrographia. We are all subject to making mistakes and errors as a consequence of the fall, because a consequence of original sin. Experiment is a way to overcome that, right? We can talk in the Q&A about what the logic of that is, but I'm just showing you that it's right there. Okay. So summing up then, if we think about a move, as I said right at the outset, how do we get this shift from the contemplative to the active, and the active life being associated with the natural sciences? I think we can see how that's being set up. And so what Bacon again will say is this key figure: why are we seeking knowledge? Not for contemplative resting in contemplative outcomes, right? But to restore the sovereignty that we had in our pre-fallen condition. So the true ends of knowledge aren't the pleasure of the mind. It's not contemplation, as Aristotle had taught, right? But it's the benefit and use of life. Okay? That's the goal. And then his notion of charity. Now, again, interestingly, this is a real transformation of charity, because charity was the the head of the theological virtues. Charity was a virtue. For the first time in the 17th century, we get the notion of a charity, which is a reified thing out there doing good stuff. It's a literal secularisation of what was once an interior virtue. And this is linked with the rise of science, which is seen to be charity in action. Okay? So what I attempt to do is just to lay out some of the religious motivations that give science its legitimacy, that give it its legs in the early modern period. Now, I should move on. But just to show I'm not the only person arguing this, here's Stephen Gaukroger again. Far from breaking free from religion, the early modern period sees this consolidation. And another one, Amos Funkenstein, a new approach. It's a secular theology. And just to say something, just to hark back, remember in the Middle Ages we have a distinction between the arts faculty where science was done and the theology faculty, and they were kept separate. We now have the possibility of a combination of physics and theology. It was called physico-theology, that Aristotle never would have thought possible because he thought those disciplines had to be kept separate. Okay? So in all of this is also a rejection of not merely the Aristotelian and Christian elevation of contemplation, but there's a crossing of disciplinary boundaries that Aristotle wouldn't have approved of. Okay, so what I've tried to persuade you here is that there's a set of values that give science its legs, that consolidate it, move it to the centre, and the appeal is to religious values. It's not a breaking away from religion, it's the formation of a closer set of legitimising bonds with religion that makes science possible at all. Now, the other point I want to make in relation to naturalism is that the foundations of this science, its presuppositions, were also thoroughly theological, and that's what we've jumped to. That's the idea of science and the supernatural. Now, from the dawn of time, as they say, people have been aware that nature has regularities. Only in the 17th century are those regularities understood in terms of laws of nature. Laws of nature in the physical realm are invented in the 17th century, and they're invented by this guy Descartes. And the idea of laws of nature is different from Aristotle's idea that the regularities in the world are a function of the inherent properties of things. For Descartes, they're not. Things don't have any inherent properties because they're inert particles. What moves them around? God. Okay. So God imparts motion to matter. He did it at the start and continues to do it. And God then is the efficient cause of everything that happens. That is to say, nothing happens in the world without God moving it. Okay. How does God move it? He moves it according to laws that he has chosen, right? So Descartes will say, nature is really God doing all that stuff. So when things move according to a law, God is moving them moment by moment according to a mathematical law that he has instantiated or stamped on the world. That's Descartes' invention. It's related to a theological position called voluntarism, where the divine will runs everything. And this became the dominant conception of how nature operated. And although there's talk in Philosophy 101 about a conflict between the continental rationalists and the British empiricists, they were completely agreed on this conception of laws of nature. So here's our friend Boyle again. Laws of motion did not spring from the nature of matter. That was the Aristotelian view. Regularities are inherent in matter. They're not. They come from the will of God. They're imposed on nature. Here's Newton, or it's actually Roger Coates writing in the preface of Newton. The business of philosophy is what, science that is, to inquire what laws God chose when he created the world, okay? Not those that he might have had he so pleased. That last bit's a bit of a dig at Descartes. So there was a difference. But what they were agreed on was that there were immutable, unchangeable, universal, eternal laws of nature, and they got all of those properties, their immutability, their eternal nature, their unchangeableness, from the divine nature. They're direct reflection of God's divine nature. And this is quite explicit in Descartes. Okay. So what does this mean for how we understand nature? Well, Samuel Clarke, who was probably the leading philosophical theologian of the early 18th century, and he is the guy who champions Newton. Remember, Newton and Leibniz both invented calculus simultaneously, and so of course there's going to be accusations of plagiarism and so on. But Leibniz also had worries about Newton's conception of the world, so there was a squabble, and Samuel Clarke represented the Newtonian position in these discussions. But here's what he says about nature. Nature is nothing but God doing stuff, okay? Everything that we call natural is really just supernatural, and consequently there's no such thing as the course of nature. It's all supernatural, right? Everything that's going on in the world is supernatural because God is doing it all. Does that sound like naturalism to you? The answer is no, okay? But does it lend itself to naturalism? And that's really, I think, the trick. So let's just say that this idea of the laws of nature is very powerful in Britain, and it persists until well into the 19th century. So here is one of the leading authorities on the philosophy of science saying, again, what are laws of nature? This is Herschel in the early 19th century. Laws of nature are God doing stuff. And most of the men of science signed up to that understanding of laws of nature. Okay. How do things change? Let's move to the rise of naturalism. And it's helpful at this point to come back to the understanding of naturalism that I laid out right at the beginning, which is Sean Carroll's view of naturalism. And just look at what's in yellow. And I think pretty much everything there, Newton, Descartes, Boyle and the gang would agree with, right? They would agree with that. There is one world, right? The natural world, it has these patterns called the laws of nature. They're discoverable by the sciences. There is no separate realm of the supernatural because the natural realm is supernatural, okay? So they would agree with just about everything. What's the difference? The difference is really just a matter of description, okay? So it's possible when you have a single conception of order that is lawful that you just redescribe it. And people in the 19th century did that. And they redescribed this radical supernaturalism of the 17th century as naturalism. And they said the laws of nature are sufficient in themselves, right? We don't need to go past the laws of nature to explain what they are. We just take those as brute features of the natural world and we just give it the label naturalism, and there's no need for anything else, right? So many aspects of this are completely consistent with what Newton and the gang were saying, but now it falls under a different description. Now that description is naturalism. So we can say modern naturalism is simply a redescription of the thoroughly theologised world of the pioneers of modern science, albeit with the question of the ultimate source of those laws no longer asked. People just don't ask that question anymore. Modern naturalism, in other words, borrows the intelligibility that belonged to the original theological framework, but no longer asks the question about why we would think there are immutable laws at all, why they have the character they do, and where they come from. The question is then, how did we end up in a situation where the laws of nature, which once stood as evidence of God's intimate involvement in the natural world, somehow became evidence of the impossibility of that involvement? And the answer, as is the case with these historical questions, is complicated. And the long version is in the book Some New World, which you might have heard about. And I say that book is that thick, but really about that much of its footnotes. So it's only about 40 pages of text. So it's really a much easier read than it looks. But let me just give you 2 points, right? Because it is a bit of a complicated story. But first, I think it's important to understand that the idea of a natural-supernatural distinction is historically late, as I indicated right at the beginning of the lecture. Supernatural is not a term that appears in any of the canonical sources of Christianity. People don't construct the world in that way. They do have a sense of created versus uncreated, but it's not a natural-supernatural distinction. The word doesn't appear in official Catholic documents until 1567. That's the first mention of supernatural in Catholic official documents. Although, as I said to you, Aquinas starts to use it in the 13th century, but Aquinas doesn't use it to talk about a two-tiered reality. He uses it to talk about the particular sets of gifts that God bestows upon people, the supernatural gifts, okay? Like the supernatural virtues would be another use that Aquinas uses. Not a two-tiered stuff, but a particular character of a virtue. And second thing to say is that the ism, naturalism, doesn't emerge until the 19th century. So we don't get this ism of naturalism until the 19th century. And crucial to the making of this distinction, I think how they managed to sell this was that the guys, the naturalists who made the change, retold the whole historical story. Right? They had to retell the story because the true story is not consistent with the emergence of naturalism. So I just want to spend just the last few minutes of the lecture explaining how they told that story, because it's in one sense it's quite a familiar story. So that brings us to eventually fabricating history. So we just have time in the last 10 minutes to look at one important figure in the association of science with naturalism, and that's the figure Thomas Henry Huxley, autodidact and biologist whose enthusiastic support for evolutionary theory earned him the name Darwin's bulldog. And so some people talk about Richard Dawkins as Darwin's Rottweiler. Thomas Henry Huxley was Darwin's bulldog. Interestingly, Huxley was never really sold on the idea of natural selection, but he really went into bat for Darwin and Darwinian evolution. He was a scientific populariser, really intelligent guy, taught himself Hebrew, he taught himself German so he could read German biblical criticism, really quite a remarkable figure. But he was the guy who was a key figure in the invention of scientific naturalism. He popularised the expression scientific naturalism. And Huxley took pains to argue that scientific naturalism was not a recent and short-lived fad, but that it had been characteristic of scientific forms of knowledge from the very beginning. That was the crucial thing that Thomas Henry Huxley had to argue. So history became part of the case for naturalism. So as he put it, there was a struggle between naturalism and supernaturalism from the very beginning. Okay, over the records of the course of civilization, characterised by this particular struggle. But Huxley thought that the victory of naturalism over supernaturalism was inevitable. So theologians, they're the ones who are the victims of the march of progress, of the progress of science. That's the story there. So this is a zero-sum game. This is how Huxley understands history. A zero-sum game with theology and science, and there's a struggle, and there can only be one winner. Now, the idea that the historical development of knowledge fitted an inexorable pattern, and that pattern involved a move away from supernaturalistic explanations toward naturalistic ones, had been a theme of historical explanation since the French Enlightenment. Okay, we'll skip that. One of the better-known versions of this, I think, is Auguste Comte's idea that knowledge moves through three stages: the theological stage, the metaphysical stage, and the scientific stage. There's a kind of inexorability to this historical process. Now, Huxley was not a fan of... Huxley thought that Comte was a bit of a dill in certain respects, but he bought into this understanding of history, and this was how people understood history. If you look at the first anthropologists, magic and superstition, and then through something like theology, and then you end up with science, okay? Now, once you have this understanding, it matches perfectly well with Huxley's notion of a struggle between the natural and the supernatural, because at the inflection points between the theological and the metaphysical stage, there will be a rearguard action by the theologians to try and maintain their view, right? So the struggle is going to be manifested, or even though this is inexorable and inevitable, theology will be there fighting it to the death. So that's the argument. So a common feature of this historiography was that progress is intrinsic to historical development, and the emergence and consolidation of science was inevitable unless there's something to stop it. Now, what I've suggested to you earlier in the lecture is it's completely opposite. Science is exceptional. It's rare. When it appears, that's what has to be explained. For these guys, science is inevitable, and what has to be explained historically is what's stopping it, right? What's stopping it? And you can guess what's stopping it for these constructions of history. It's religion. That's what's stopping science. Okay, so on the view of Kant and Huxley, it's its failure to emerge that's what we have to explain. And as I've said, on the latter case, it's invariably religion that stalls the progress of science. Now, once this progressivist naturalistic framework is forced onto the historical record, it simply becomes a matter of trying to find the figures who represent retrospectively the forces of scientific progress, or conversely of religious regression. Now, Huxley set out what I think is a kind of paradigmatic account of this in his writings, associating the bare story goes something like this: the ancient Greeks invented science, and they invented science by moving away from the theological explanations of the poets. There's a bit of a textual basis for this in Aristotle, but what we've seen of Aristotle already is that's complete nonsense, because Aristotle's a guy who places theology at the top of the tree in terms of his theoretical sciences. So that can't be right. But anyway, so it starts with the Greeks. They invent science. Then Christianity comes along. It kills it dead through the Middle Ages. And then science gets up and running once it gets out from under the oppressive forces of medieval Christianity. So this historical pattern then becomes entrenched in 19th century thinking. Here it is, as Huxley puts it, the Aryans of Ionia, it's the Greeks. Interestingly, the Greeks themselves said it actually started elsewhere. So it started in Babylon and Egypt and so on. That's what the Greeks say, but this is what these guys say. Even Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century said, nah, philosophy didn't start with the Greeks. Anyway, now we have the story. It starts with the Greeks, dammed up for 1,000 years by the Catholic Church, and now with the Renaissance and Reformation, it starts to flow again, right? And as I said, this becomes then the kind of leitmotif of historical explanation, and that's also the core of this notion of an enduring battle between science and religion. So this guy is one of the famous progenitors of the conflict of science and religion in history, Andrew Dickson White. Okay, it's a struggle between dogmatic theology, and these are eras in human thought. Okay, and then again, it's Christianity that arrested the normal development of the physical sciences. So this idea, there's this inexorable drive in history towards science. And we see this then repeated. This is the popular view then of the history of science. Just give you one example. Here's Karl Popper. Just tells the story straight as if he's been reading it out of Huxley. So this would have been used to Newton. So this motif about an enduring conflict between the natural and the supernatural has become really a key part of popular stories about science and religion. And I think less excusably, we actually find it in textbooks in the social sciences. So those textbooks, that tapestry of culture is just one example that I'm giving you, but there's a whole range of anthropology and psychology textbooks that tell the story about this historical conflict between science and religion. Okay, folks, let's wrap it up. It should be obvious from the actual history that I've outlined earlier that in this lecture, this dominant cultural narrative that links historical progress to naturalistic science is simply false. Far from theological considerations hindering the advance of science, they were essential. They were essential to its foundation in terms of laws of nature. They were crucial for its social consolidation. But also recall that the consolidation of science was accompanied by a transformation of the very religious values that were being appealed to, shifting the focus away from the cultivation of the virtues to a literal cultivation and domination of the natural world. To a degree also, the rise of a utilitarian outlook was linked to religious justifications for the pursuit of science. And so while the close alliance of certain Christian values and modern science gives a lie to the common story that aligns science with naturalism, the Huxley story is just wrong, in other words, questions might still be asked about whether this alliance is altogether healthy. And we might also ask whether the new early modern conception of laws of nature, which in the end lent itself to a naturalising agenda, was a positive development. These go to questions about the complicity of Christianity in the desacralisation of nature, and these we will consider in the final lecture, along with a broader consideration of the consequences of our domination of the universities by the naturalistic assumptions of knowledge that were set up in the 19th century. Thank you. Yeah, I'll choose that one. Yeah.
Right, here we are with questions again. And so I will have the privilege of reading out the questions. And please, if you've got questions, please go to these locations. And away we go. If Aristotle named spiritual knowing as the highest level of knowledge, why did many Sorry,
It's going off the edge of the screen.
sorry guys, just bear with me a second.
It's all right. We need textbook. Do you want to do the second question? Is the second question intelligible?
You can remember.
No, I can't. Just talk amongst yourselves.
If Aristotle named spiritual knowing as the highest level of knowledge, why did many ancient universities not include theology as a field of study? That's right. You can look after it from there, thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. So here I think it's first of all it's really crucial to distinguish between Aristotle's conception of theology and what theology became as a field of study in the first medieval universities, and so my introductory remarks this evening help, I think, place this in context that for the first 1,000 years or so of Christianity, theology in the Western tradition was regarded with suspicion, and it was regarded with suspicion because that was pagan reasoning about the gods, and that was contrasted with sacred doctrine or holy teaching, which was as I said, Christianity did not have a conception of theology, right? So when theology begins to emerge as a formal course of study, and interestingly, it does by means of the application of the Aristotelian categories of logic to elements of the Christian faith, right? That actually becomes something very distinctly different from what Aristotle had conceived of theology as being as this pure contemplative activity by which we become godlike, right? So two senses of theology, and again, as I've said, whereas training in theology was far from the most popular of the three higher faculties. Really, it was supply and demand. So it was really what the church required in terms of theological training, and canon law was more important than theology. And remember also that certainly in the 12th century, the very status of theology is contested, which is to say, is this something we ought to be doing anyway, or is this just the kind of logic chopping operation that takes us away from the essence of Christianity, which is about spiritual practice? Okay, so that's I'll stop there.
Thank you. Do you have any comment on the changing value applied to the tray of curiosity over time? That is, I don't think it's always been thought of as a virtue.
Well, how long have you got? Yes. So curiosity was a vice. Curiosity was one of the vices. Augustine will talk about this at length, but in the classifications of the vices in the medieval period, curiosity was a vice that came under the category of pride. And part of this was because curiosity was implicated in the fall of Adam and Eve. So the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was regarded as motivated by curiosity. So, and because pride was the worst of the sins, curiosity a subset of pride. So in the taxonomy of the vices, curiosity had a significant role. If we move to the Aristotelian understanding of the virtues, you'll recall, well, you probably don't recall because we haven't said this, but for Aristotle, the virtues, as we know, were qualities that helped us achieve particular ends. But Aristotle had an understanding of the virtues that the virtue was a mean between two extremes. Okay? Now, in the quest for knowledge, curiosity was an extreme version of that it sought it was too much of the quest for knowledge, okay, as opposed to ignorance, which was not enough. So even in the classical understanding of the virtues, curiosity was problematic because it was regarded as an extreme version of the quest for knowledge. Now what happens though, interestingly, and this is again interesting in light of the various changes of the valence of the virtues in the early modern period, Bacon plays a key role in rehabilitating curiosity, and he will refer to this explicitly. He will refer explicitly to arguments against curiosity, and one of the standard things that was alleged against curiosity was the Pauline statement: knowledge puffs up and charity builds up. Okay, and that was used to say, well, it's about charity, it's not about knowledge. But Bacon said, no, knowledge is the means by which we express charity. Knowledge makes charity possible through practical acts. And again, this was part of his justification for the natural sciences. So what he wanted to say is that there is a false curiosity, but there is a genuine curiosity that we need to have in order to arrive at knowledge that can help us put charity into action. So he explicitly took it head on. And I don't know if some of those quotes up there, the quote, in relation, you would have seen in relation to the fall, there was a reference in one of the quotes I had up that said that there's a version of the quest for knowledge that actually helps redeem us rather than puts us into our fallen condition. So as I say, how long have you got? But it's an interesting question that the transformation of curiosity from a vice to a virtue is really necessary for the new science to get up and running, and Bacon is a key figure in rehabilitating it.
Thank you. With the concept of science as an attempt to regain Eden as before the fall, if it were possible to regain Eden, wouldn't there be less need for God as a salvation element? Or is it only ever a partial attempt?
Look, what these guys argued was for a partial regaining of Eden. But, there's one part of the story that I didn't talk about, and that is there's a significant eschatological dimension also in the rise of modern science. And one of the arguments, and again Bacon uses this argument, but others used it too, was that the reformation of knowledge was a prelude to the impending eschaton. And he used a passage from Daniel: many shall go to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And that quote is actually on the frontispiece of one of his books. And what he interpreted that to mean was in the voyages of discovery, following the voyages of discovery, there would be an increase in knowledge as a prelude to the end of the world. This was the apocalyptic prophecy of Daniel. So one of the arguments about the new sciences was that insofar as we engaged in these scientific activities, we were doing the right thing that would bring about the prophesied end of the world. Now, following the Restoration, those sorts of eschatological arguments in England became rather suspect. So we have to have a kind of routinisation of the eschatological expectations to cut a long story short. But wouldn't you need God? Well, let me put it another way. I think the theological worry of someone like Bacon is that it's a kind of Pelagian rather than an Augustinian understanding of what's going on, which is to say that by human works we can accomplish salvation. In that sense, you might say, well, divine grace is not necessary. So Bacon has a strongly Augustinian view of the fall, but he doesn't have a strongly Augustinian view of divine grace, I think. And so the kind of argument you might want to mount in theological terms is that divine grace doesn't seem to be really necessary because we're doing it ourselves. And that's the Pelagian as opposed to the Augustinian view in terms of those theological categories.
Why did it seem obvious to Descartes and Newton that laws of nature were divine? And equally obvious to 19th century thinkers that the laws of nature were not divine.
Yeah, so I think the 19th century part is the interesting one. And I think these guys, for other reasons, were, in the 19th century, they had other reasons for not believing in God. Although Huxley always said he was agnostic rather than an atheist. But there was a much stronger tradition of French atheism. I've told mostly the English story. Now, at what point do we see... Oh, sorry, that's the next question. Why? I mean, look, I think what you have to understand is that what is the position that Descartes is inheriting? And the position he's inheriting from the Aristotelian scholasticism of the Middle Ages is that God is working causally at a number of different levels in the natural world. There's a basic distinction between primary and secondary causes, but it's more complicated than that. I mean, God works through what we call the final cause, which is the things that... Now, let me just try and keep this simple. Descartes inherits a view of causation where God is operating causally at different levels. What he does is he essentially reduces it to a single layer of efficient causality. That's what I think we would say. And so what the effect of that is to reduce the agency of things in the natural world to do things in terms of their own capacities. They are purely powered by what it is that God does. So it's not as if Descartes decides that God's going to do this. What Descartes does is he inherits an understanding of causality that everyone has and puts a particular theological take on it. And it's actually tied up with a medieval view called voluntarism that emphasizes the divine will over, we might again crudely put, the divine intellect. And why this is important for the English, you would have seen that, the quote from the Newton's Principia, God could choose any framework of laws, right? Because the divine will, we don't know, and this was the difference with Descartes, God can instantiate any number of laws. How do we know what laws God has chosen? We have to investigate nature empirically, right? But when we do that, what we're discovering is the rationale that God has used. So, and it's interesting, Descartes quite radically said God could have decreed that 2 + 2 = 5. Now, I don't know how you make sense of that, but there's a kind of... And so in the moral realm, this is the Calvinist view that God could essentially get that God makes up the moral rules, okay? And so that maps across into the physical world, that God makes up the physical rules. I'm going on a bit here. Bottom line is Descartes inherits a theological framework and changes it. So the most important shift is when that theological stuff is just taken out. But the question for the 19th century, of course, is how do you explain the intelligibility of the natural world? But that's just taken for granted by then.
Thank you. At what point do we see the transition from science being defined as the study of creation to modern secular science, the world being defined in the absence of a creator?
Well, look, I think it parallels the previous question, and it's well, the point is, the point varies, but in the English tradition, it's essentially the 19th century when we have the rise of naturalism that ceases to see the world as divine creation. But I think there are traditions preceding that, as I say, especially on the continent. But the English view is very much in favour of a natural theology that sees God at work in the world. You get versions of materialism earlier in France. So the points of transition shift a little bit. But, you know, England's where it's all happening in terms of science. So you don't worry about the rest. I exaggerate.
How or why did the modern world come to be dominated by Western values if ancient Greece, China, etc. didn't share them?
Well, because these distinctive values are Christian values, right? So that's why. My argument is that the distinctive feature is you get a particular Christian theological conception of what's going on in the world, and you don't get it. The Greeks don't have it. The Chinese don't have it. The Indians don't have it. Interestingly, you do. I mean, Islam does have it to some extent. Okay, so that's the interesting thing. And so the failure of science consolidated in Islamic cultures is an interesting question. And I think it's really more to do with material factors than to do with what we might call the realm of ideas. But so, well, that's the short answer.
Great, thank you.
There was a question down the front, but I don't know if we're doing that the old-fashioned way. But
Please.
I was wondering, maybe two questions. Firstly, if you could elaborate on what sort of virtues might be represented by being involved in experimental science. I think the second question was,
Just hold that and let's repeat the question. Is that all right?
yeah, so the question is, what's the nature of the logic of these arguments that experimental science makes you virtuous? How's that supposed to work? Well, I think it works in various ways. One argument was that in becoming familiar with how God does things, we become imbued with gratitude for and admiration for the design that's gone into it and the way that it's adapted to particular ends. So that becoming familiar with nature just makes us admire the creator that produced them. That's part of the argument. You know, there were also other arguments that it was partly about modesty, for example. The reason you had to do lots of experiments, have lots of people involved, cumulative, and they're characteristic features of experimental science. So this is really to do with modesty. But that was the general line. And as I say, I didn't sort of mention it. What's interesting is that you do get the sciences are not strongly represented in the universities at this period, but you do get arguments for, why should we study geology later, or why should we study this? And very often it's the moral formative aspects of these that are important. But what you would say, again speaking for the English tradition, because there's a strong tradition of natural theology, that we can know God through the natural world, that then becomes a very powerful motivation for studying nature. And interesting, so Stephen Gaukrodger, his idea about them coming together the way they do is it's natural theology. Now, I'm not entirely, I think there's other reasons for that union, but natural theology certainly is a very strong aspect of the English understanding, and that's then what motivates this powerful alliance between natural science and natural theology.
Great, thank you. Your second question, briefly?
somewhat answered,
Okay, thank you. Did Newton and co align science with theology to gain acceptance for science rather than any implicit belief in the unity of science and theology?
So, look, so let's leave Newton aside because he's a kind of difficult case. But I think so the question is, do they think science is worth pursuing independently, and then they go fishing around for reasons why you do it? Now, that's not what I see, because what I see is that to actually get science up and running, you actually have to have these values. So it's not as if the question is motivated by assumptions about science we have today. It's just obvious it's something you do because it's useful, it does this, this and this. That's not the case in the 17th century. So I think what happens in the 17th century is, given that this is not an obvious thing to do, why are we doing it in the first place? And I think these people are absolutely sincere in their theological motivations for doing it, right? So the counter case then would be, well, do we have people who don't share these convictions who are doing it? And I think we do, I think we do, but I think it's more the case that religious motivations have been written out of the history than I'm writing them in, okay? So that's it. So, but certainly it's an apologetic exercise for science so that they're engaged in. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I'm not. What I'm saying is, I think they're sincere in their appeal to religious values.
Thank you. When Francis Bacon says they are ill discoverers that think that there is no land when they can see nothing to see, isn't he suggesting some form of methodological naturalism as a feature of empirical science? That's a cracker of a question, Peter. I think you might need to read that one a second yourself.
They're ill discoverers and they can see nothing but see. Isn't he suggesting no? Short answer. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Look, partly, I'm not sure what... Okay, let me give a very general question. That I think that medieval science is a bit more naturalistic than early modern science because there's a bit of an attempt to keep them apart. And one of the reasons for that is they recognise the legitimacy of Aristotelian natural philosophy. And Aristotle, he's not secular as we know, obviously, but they see a model for science that's not imbued with Christian theology, so they think that's a possibility. But as I've been suggesting, once the early modern period moves away from that conception of science, and that puts it in a very different situation. The term people don't talk about naturalism until the 19th century. The term methodological naturalism was really only came into use in the 1960s. Its first mention was in the 1930s. And I don't think there is, not only that terminological, as you know, I'm crazy for the terms as marking a significant shift. I'd be very surprised if there's an idea that corresponds to a methodological naturalism that's invented in the 20th century back in the 17th century, although slightly contradicting myself, we do have something a little bit like that in some of the medieval thinkers who make a distinction between theology and natural philosophy.
I think we're probably heading towards our last question because time is running out. This last question is, how do you draw a boundary to eliminate occasionalism when methodological naturalism is insufficient?
Okay, so occasionalism, just for the punters out there, occasionalism is the doctrine that there is no cause in the natural world except God, okay? And so things that look like they're natural events are just occasions for God to act. And occasionalism is usually associated with the philosopher Malebranche, who is a Cartesian thinker. And people say he invented it to get around the mind-body dualism problem, but he didn't. Occasionalism, I think, was pretty much rife in the period. And my argument is that if you accept this strong view of laws of nature, then essentially you're buying into what looks like an occasionalist understanding. And occasionalism as a doctrine, we find this in Islamic philosophy very early on, Asharite philosophy. And ironically, Al-Ghazali was one of the guys he ran with. Ironically, people say Islamic occasionalism killed off Islamic science. That's one of the arguments you see. But it's actually core to early modern science. It's a core of early modern science. Sorry, I better get back to the question. But I'm not sure what that causal theory has to do with methodological naturalism. Here's the historical connection, though. I think if God, and here again is the problem with God is the cause of everything that's going on in the world. When David Hume comes along, he looks at Malebranche's philosophy. Malebranche says there are no causes in the natural world. God is doing it all. And Hume agrees with the first part of that, but he denies the second part. So Hume says there are no causes in the world. All we have is, in our minds, we see constant conjunctions of things and we attribute causation in that sense. But causation doesn't exist in the world out there. Now, that's a way of getting around the laws of nature problem. And this is why, we're doing History Philosophy 101 here, this is why when Immanuel Kant comes along and says that Hume has roused him from his dogmatic stubbornness, because Kant has this idea that causation isn't out there in the world either, that causation, space, time and causation are things that the human mind imposes on our perceptions and structures them, right? But we're getting a long way here. But occasionalism is really an important part of the story of modern philosophy, and the Humean account of causation is, I think, quite interesting in that context. And that leads us on the path to this Kantian understanding about the a priori categories of our mind that structure reality in ways that aren't out there, but that are in here. Okay? But that's another story. That'll be the next New College lectures. Okay, good. Thank you.
Call on Reverend Dr. A.J. Culp to come and give a vote of thanks to our lecturer.
Sometime back when we were living in Brisbane, I found myself in a doctor's office, and as it turned out, this was a preeminent doctor. It was my first time visiting him, but he's the kind of doctor who was the physician for a professional sports team, who's very acclaimed in the area. As we made small talk, he picked up my accent and asked me about American universities. As it turned out, his daughter had received a prestigious scholarship to play sports at one of the American universities. And in due course, he asked me what I had studied and what brought us to Australia. And so I told him my original training was in English literature and rhetoric, and I went on to study theology, a field that I lectured in at that time, and that is why we had come to Australia. I've never quite experienced this, but at saying this, he rocked back in his chair, and he looked at me with such astonishment. It was as if I had told him that I specialized in horse-drawn carriages and that I was marketing them still. And furthermore, that the Australian government found this as a worthwhile thing to give me a visa for. And now I should say this doctor seemed like a good and kindly man. And with any man in his station of life, he did not lack confidence. So it was with a mixture of superiority and pity that he went on to tell me that, unlike me, his field was one of pure objectivity. And I remember his words very clearly, pure objectivity. And he shared at some length how fortunate we were as a society that we had moved beyond the fantasy of the humanities and the superstition of theology. Again, he said it with complete confidence, right? And science, he assured me, was the way of progress, the way of the future. Now, he was a new doctor, so I didn't think it was a time to discuss things with him, but so I just kind of took it. But I have to admit, I was speechless. I just kind of sat there awestruck. And of course, I've heard this idea from many corners of society, many different types of people, but never had I heard it from a man of, in traditional terms, we consider a man of letters, a thought leader in our society, in our community. Indeed, it left me wondering how someone who had been carried along by Western tradition, a tradition that is largely grown out of the stream of humanities and indeed theology, could come to believe something, could come to make such a confident statement as if it were the only logical thing to say. And I have to say, I think in reading Peter's work, his most recent work, and also just listening to his lectures yesterday and especially tonight, it, for me, casts great light on this difficult issue. I think I've come to fully understand how someone such as this preeminent doctor could say that and could believe that fully. And I think it reminds me as well of what Peter's project is and what he's been working on. Of one of my favorite novelists, the farmer, poet, and novelist Wendell Berry, in one of his great essays titled, "What Are People For?" What are people for? Now, I believe Peter will be speaking more to this question in tomorrow night's lecture, but I just wanted to say a sincere thank you to Peter for casting so much light on this difficult but important issue of our day. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's been great to be able to share this evening with you. Look, just a few reminders from me. First is there are books up the back here, so please go and have a look at those, especially Peter's book. Supper is served, I believe, over on the far corner there, and there are drinks over in this corner, so please feel welcome. Those of you that are physically here, as opposed to those of you that are out there somewhere, please feel welcome to stay with us. And of course, please come back tomorrow night when we conclude. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.